Donors pour tens of millions of dollars into the Democrats' campaign for the White House as Vice President Kamala Harris firms the person to take on Donald Trump. Woodside buys a US LNG group for nearly $2 billion, and the government pushes for more female representation on peak sporting groups. Welcome to Fear and Greed Daily Business News. For people who make their own decisions, it is Tuesday, the 23rd of July, 2024. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Sean, the main story this morning, money is pouring in for Kamala Harris, the most likely Democrat nominee to run against Donald Trump in the US presidential election in November.
In the 7 hours after President Joe Biden said he won't run for president again, Ms. Harris raised $47 million, the most the Biden-Harris campaign has ever raised in one day. Of course, there's also about $159 million of funds sitting there with Joe Biden, which would be transferred to Ms. Harris if she becomes the nominee. That looks extremely likely, given Mr. Biden nominated her to take on Donald Trump, though it isn't assured. Democrat politicians and heavyweights are mostly supporting Kamala Harris. Bill and Hillary Clinton, state governors, Democratic senators, they've all come out in support of her. No other top Democrats have challenged her. Maybe more notable, there are some who haven't quite come out in support of Ms. Harris yet. Barack Obama, for example, congratulated Joe Biden, but withheld his support for Kamala Harris. Meanwhile, plaudits for Joe Biden came from around the world, from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who thanked the US president for his unwavering support, to the leaders of the UK, countries in Europe and Canada. The Trump camp weren't quite so positive, with the Republican nominee calling Mr. Biden the worst president ever. J.D. Vance, Donald Trump's running mate, tweeted, "If Joe Biden ends his re-election campaign, how can he justify remaining president?" Which is a bit odd, really, because, Barack Obama served 2 terms, and just because he wasn't going to run again, didn't have to step down or anything. Anyway, you can imagine, Michael, what's going on from both sides of politics in the US.
Oh, the theatre, Sean. It's just something else altogether. What about locally, though? What was the response here?
Well, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said Mr. Biden will be able to retire from public life in January with an extraordinary record. Mr. Albanese nominated climate change, the introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act, his support for Ukraine, his COVID-19 recovery efforts, and his support for gender equality as key achievements. The Prime Minister said the AUKUS relationship is just one aspect of the closeness between Australia and the United States, and President Biden has been a great friend of ours, and that will continue. When asked whether he supported Vice President Kamala Harris to become the next presidential nominee, he said it was a matter for the Democratic Party. Opposition leader Peter Dutton also thanked the US president and pointed to the security alliance between the US, UK and Australia as one of his lasting achievements. Former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull said Mr. Biden had done the right thing, while National MP Barnaby Joyce said he should have stepped away earlier. Arthur Sinodinos, a former ambassador in Washington, and I think one of the most sensible voices in US-Australian relations, he urged the government not to react emotionally to ensure Australia's interests are best served in the US.
What about local markets, Sean? How did they react to the news?
Well, generally, equity markets in the region dropped, with the S&P ASX 200 closing down 0.5%. Initially, it fell by almost 1%, but pared back losses in late trading. Energy stocks fell most, followed by materials, real estate investment trusts and telcos. Among the large caps, the banks were flat or lower. Goodman Group dropped more than 2%, while REA and QBE were both off 1%. The retailers were strong performers, led by Coles, Woolies and Wesfarmers. Insignia Financial's share price jumped 5% after it said it expects higher than forecast earnings. Another to say that was Iris, and its share price closed up 9%.
Very convenient, Sean, that you mentioned Wesfarmers just before, because after the show today, you have an interview coming up with Gaurav Sodhi from Intelligent Investor, and you really take a very close look at Wesfarmers.
Yeah, so we don't normally look at one stock, but we decided to look at Wesfarmers because it's a particularly interesting company, given it's a conglomerate, which there aren't many of those left. It's dominated by its retail arm, which is Bunnings and Kmart primarily. So we asked Gaurav about Wesfarmers, its history, whether it's a good buy or sell at the moment in terms of market pricing, and what the future holds. So it's just a really interesting chat and look at one of Australia's biggest companies.
Yeah, it is a fascinating one. It's coming up after the show. Of course, we are not an investing podcast, and you should seek professional advice before making investment decisions. But go and have a listen to Gaurav, because he's a great communicator and knows this space so well. And it's just such a fascinating story with Kmart and Bunnings and all of it. Stick around for that one. It's coming up later. What's happening in international markets, Sean?
Earnings season on Wall Street gets interesting over the next few days, with Google's parent Alphabet and Tesla due to release profit reports tomorrow morning, Australian time. Futures trading in the US, well, it showed a little movement following Joe Biden's decision to not run for office. Broadly, equity traders would prefer if Donald Trump beats the Democrat nominee because part of his platform is to cut the corporate tax rate. Companies that might win if trade barriers are increased or if inflation rises, they've also benefited. The fact that the markets at the Wall Street at least didn't do a huge amount suggests that equity investors still think Donald Trump is the most likely president. Having said that, there's a long way to go, and Kamala Harris will certainly get a bump in coming days just by being part of the news cycle, I'd say. Michael, plenty going on in commodity markets. Iron ore prices are lower, heading towards $100 an ounce. Now, inventory levels at Chinese ports have risen, and Chinese steel production is off. We've also had higher shipments from key markets such as Australia and Brazil. Put all that together, you get higher supply, lower demand, therefore downward pressure on prices. That's why people like BHP, Fortescue Metals and Rio didn't do so well yesterday in the market. Then there's copper. That's considered a benchmark for the global growth. Last week, copper had its worst 5 days since 2022, down 5%. Now, it peaked back in May, but since then, demand from China has disappointed. Last week's third plenum in Beijing did little to stimulate the world's second largest economy. That sent copper lower. A bunch of other metals like aluminium, tin, and nickel also fell. Now, having said all that, on a historical basis, copper prices remain pretty high. Also, a pretty good story in the world of oil. Oil prices rose after Joe Biden's announcement. That followed a big fall late last week. The other factor impacting the price of oil is bushfires in Alberta, Canada, which we don't normally talk about. But apparently, an estimated 348,000 barrels a day of production are at risk. I had no idea that Alberta was such a big producer of oil.
It is.
Yeah. Of course, we've got all the stuff going on in the Middle East. That's sort of putting pressure on oil prices as well. Can't forget gold either. It benefits when there's uncertainty around the place, and the precious metal rose after the Biden announcement, as did the US dollar. That pushed the Aussie dollar back towards 66.5 US cents, somewhere where I'm sure you find it much more comfortable.
Yeah, yes, it feels like it's very familiar terrain around here, doesn't it? Now, Sean, just listening to all of that, you got kind of copper, and gold and oil and the Aussie dollar and all of these things. It's very fertile ground for questions. And I know that I'm actually putting a call out to listeners here to help me stump Sean, because twice a week we put out a little bonus episode of Fear and Greed called Ask Fear and Greed. It comes out about midday on a Tuesday and midday on a Thursday. And it is basically listener questions about various things. If there's something that you're interested in that you're not kind of sure about, we've had some great questions recently. We've got a great one coming up today about whether it's possible to vary the GST as an alternative mechanism to help combat inflation instead of using interest rates. But if you have a question about any of those things like copper or aluminium or tin or nickel or oil prices or something like that, send them on through. Jump onto fearandgreed.com.au, send them through, or get on Facebook or LinkedIn or Instagram or any one of those platforms, send them on through. And
don't make them too hard. That's my only request.
I'm trying to stitch you up a little bit here, Sean, and I'm enlisting everyone to get on board and just stitch up Sean in our Ask Fear and Greed podcast, out twice a week. Send through your questions and we'll have a bit of fun with that. Sean, we've got plenty still to get through. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, Woodside Energy will buy US LNG company Tellurian for $1.8 billion as Australia's biggest oil and gas company extends its global reach.
Woodside Chief Executive Meg O'Neill said the deal will position the company to tap global demand for LNG, making the company a powerhouse in the market. She said having complementary positions in Australia and the US will help capture markets across the Atlantic and Pacific basins. The purchase is somewhat opportunistic. Tellurian has spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars trying to finance and build the Driftwood LNG plant in Louisiana. Last year, it said it might not be able to cover operating and debt costs due to continued losses and dwindling cash reserves. Gas is broadly now considered the most important transition energy as the world shifts renewable, and people will be using gas for decades to come, hence Woodside's purchase. Its share price fell 2% yesterday.
South 32 share price fell 13% yesterday, Sean, after it warned about the viability of its Worsley alumina refinery, blaming the Western Australian government's strict approach to environmental approvals.
The diversified miner announced a $554 million impairment and isn't happy with the West Australian government. It said for 5 years, South 32 has been working on environmental approvals for the refinery, saying it had undertaken extensive environmental assessment and consultation with a range of stakeholders. Then, 2 weeks ago, the state's EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, said the proposal could go ahead subject to conditions. Now, South 32 says several of those conditions go beyond what's reasonable. Not happy, Jan. Otherwise, South 32's quarterly production report was broadly in line with expectations, with higher volumes across the business.
Not happy, Jan. Do you reckon there are people, younger listeners,
You have no idea
who would
what I'm
never
referring
have
to.
seen the Yellow Pages ad? Was that what it was from?
Oh, it probably is Yellow Pages, and there is a Yellow Pages still, but much smaller than there ever was before. Yes, good point.
Yeah, because it was the ad where the person, Jan, from the company forgot to put the ad in the Yellow Pages, and the boss found out and opened up the window and screamed out as Jan was running up the street.
Not happy, Jan.
Exactly. And younger listeners, perhaps Gen Z listeners, may never have actually seen it. Anyway, there's a bit of context. It's the only thing I can bring to this show, Sean. I'm not much help on the business side of things, but if you ask me about an old TV ad, I am there.
You are
now,
there.
the latest opinion polls suggest neither Prime Minister Anthony Albanese or Opposition Leader Peter Dutton are particularly popular with the electorate at the moment.
You know what I like about that sentence you just said? So you said or, like Prime Minister Anthony Albanese or Opposition Leader Peter Dutton. It actually should be nor. And there's not many opportunities to use nor.
You are absolutely right. And it's one of those ones that I often find myself Googling it just to double check because I do like to be correct. Obviously, on this occasion, I was not. And thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, no, it's just like when you say neither, you're allowed to say nor. So the two ends go together.
Oh, that's a good way to remember it. Neither nor. There we go. Thanks, Sean. We've all learned something today.
Less than a third of voters say Mr Albanese is their preferred leader of the Labor Party, and it is the same for Mr Dutton and the Liberal Party. Head-to-head, Anthony Albanese comes out on top by 7 points, but the news poll conducted for The Australian suggests a minority government is a possibility at the next election. Mr Albanese's disapproval rating is now higher than Mr Dutton's on a two-party preferred vote, which historically has been a good predictor of elections, probably the best predictor of elections. Labor is in front 51% to 49%, which is actually an improvement for the government over the past 6 weeks. The next federal poll must be held by May next year.
Sean, CrowdStrike's Australian customers have, quote, foregone their rights to pursue compensation for Friday's global outage in the Australian courts, according to one of the nation's top law firms.
A botched software upgrade is expected to cost businesses billions of dollars globally. Estimates in New South Wales alone top $200 million after big banks, hospitals, retailers and airlines were faced with what's known as the blue screen of death. James North, Head of Technology, Media and Communications at Cause Chambers Westgarth, told The Australian that extracting compensation for losses would be difficult. He said many of CrowdStrike's customers must agree to New York governing law and arbitration in Singapore, thereby forgoing access to Australian courts in pursuit of legal remedies. CrowdStrike earned more than $2 billion from companies globally last year, according to Gartner. In Australia, it was about $111 million from companies. If Mr. North from Cause Chambers Westgarth is correct, there's little legal recourse for the Aussie companies that lost money last week.
Sean, Virgin Australia will axe all flights from Cairns to Haneda just 1 year after the launch of the route, citing poor inbound tourism.
The route will cease in February 2025 because there are still 30% fewer inbound tourists from Japan to Australia. That's compared to pre-COVID. Keep in mind, of course, how weak the yen is. No doubt that's hurting Australia, at least in terms of attracting Japanese tourists. Virgin's fleet of 737 MAX 8s will be redeployed to the carrier's domestic routes. It is the latest route to Asia to be scrapped. Now, Qantas, back in May, exited from mainland China. In fact, those flights stop in about a week's time.
The number of Australians accessing the government's reverse mortgage style product to help fund their retirements rose almost 40% in the past year.
The nation's home equity access scheme was used by 13,479 people in the year to June, more than double the amount who accessed it in the corresponding period 2 years earlier, according to the Department of Social Security. Under the program, people who have reached the pension age of 67 can borrow against the equity in their property and take out a government loan, according to Bloomberg. It comes as a report released by the Actuaries Institute recommends policy changes to encourage more people to utilise the value stored in their family home or to downsize to a smaller property to help fund a shortfall in their retirement savings. Obviously, more people are taking advantage of the reverse mortgage style product, and I'm sure that reflects the cost of living crisis.
Now, Sean, the Olympics are just days away, and the Albanese government, along with some states, are developing plans to force peak sporting organisations to set aside a set number of board positions for women in exchange for funding.
Almost 56% of the 460 Australian athletes competing at the Paris Olympic Games are women, the highest proportion in history. But last year, just 25% of board chairs across the 65 sports were women, according to the Financial Review. Only 22% of chief executives were women. Sports Minister Arnica Wells, who is travelling to Paris for the Games, is expected to announce the changes in coming days. Now, in late June, the government announced about $500 million in Olympic funding, a large portion of which was allocated to the Australian Institute of Sport. The government has also doubled the amount of funding for the Paralympics, but it wants to get a better gender representation at the top of these sports.
Just quickly, Sean, in international news, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is heading to Washington to make a politically precarious speech to the US Congress, just as US politics is in turmoil.
While efforts to bring about a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas are ongoing, there's rising concerns about the war spreading to Lebanon and Yemen. Joe Biden will host Mr. Netanyahu at the White House, and whatever he says will be very closely watched everywhere. The Israeli Prime Minister is scheduled to address Congress on Wednesday. Not surprisingly, he's also now expected to meet Vice President Kamala Harris.
All right, now up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview with Gaurav Sodhi from Intelligent Investor.
All about Wesfarmers, which of course owns Bunnings and Kmart. A bit of a deep dive into that company, the goods and bads of it, whether it's a buy or sell, all sorts of things. Well worth a listen.
Yeah, particularly interesting when Gaurav's talking about the Anko brand, the success of the Kmart home brand Anko, and just how big it has become in terms of clothing and toys and all kinds of things, and the global expansion now that Wesfarmers is planning for this kind of humble brand that's come out of Kmart here in Australia. It's a really interesting conversation and well worth a listen. It is up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. And don't forget the new episode of Ask Fear and Greed, the bonus episode, is about 4 or 5 minutes long, will be out today at midday, delving into a listener question. Don't miss that one. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It is Tuesday, the 23rd of July, 2024. Make sure you're following the podcast and please join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, X, TikTok and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.